Hello, Lacy Stump.
Hello.
It's nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. It's been a long time.
I know. Yeah, I think probably since November. Because we were going to do the concert thing, and then
We were, yeah.
cases got
Skyrocketed.
worse. Yeah, skyrocketed.
Yeah.
Things went downhill, and we all hid inside of our homes. So yeah, that is quite a lot. That is quite a lot. So it's nice to be back in your lovely home with these lovely plants.
Thank you.
Yeah. Hi everyone. For everyone streaming this later, this isn't live, so I'm talking to you from the past. But this is another episode of the theories we carry. It's been a while since I've done one of these. Excited to get back into it. This is Lacy Stump with me. She's an LCMFT, which means she's a licensed clinical marriage and family therapist. She's been doing it for about 13 years.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And the reason I wanted to have her on this program is because actually the first time that we sat down and talked, you told me about this approach that you have in your work called the Crucible Approach.
Yep.
And I remember learning a lot from it personally, like coming away from that conversation with already some new perspectives on my own life and my relationships, and thought that was really cool. And that was just like probably just a summary, like a tip of the iceberg. But I was most impressed by, like, not only are you in this line of work, but you are on the cutting edge of it with your own thoughts, your own you've done your own contribution to this line, and so I'm really excited to hear about it.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I'm really happy to talk about it.
Cool. Yeah, I'm really excited too, and I think there will probably be a lot for me.
I hope so. It's definitely something I'm very passionate about, getting out more into the community, or for people to understand it, because it is a different approach than what most people practice in the therapy world. So it has been around a little while, but it doesn't have the same type of popularity as some approaches, because it's pretty sophisticated and also requires a lot more effort on the therapist's part as far as what they have to do to actually be able to deliver it. So That is also something very fundamental to it. But I really believe it's one of the best ways to help develop people and to create a society of human beings that are just better to be with. Yeah.
Good. Who doesn't want that?
Yeah. And so with everything going on now, there's always this sort of thought, I think, of how can you contribute to moving things forward. And so this is really the way that I try to do that.
Good.
So, yeah.
And then it's nice because I can be a part of it in trying to get these thoughts out there as well.
Yes, I'm very appreciative that you're willing to meet with me so I can talk about it. And it also, like I mentioned, helps me be able to better continue to improve the ways that I talk about it with people, so it is more relatable and they can pick it up in a way that it helps them to, improve or live more fulfilling lives. So
yeah.
At least maybe get a taste for it, so maybe they'll seek more information about it or something.
I think that's usually the goal.
Yes.
It's a good goal, the highest goal maybe. So before we get into your actual approach, put us in your shoes a little bit more, like into your daily life. I know you have your own offices now, I think. So tell us a little bit about what your place is like, what it looks like, what your office is like, and the kinds of people that you work with.
Gotcha. So I, April of this year, moved to like a downtown location in this really cool brick building that I'm really excited about because there's beautiful windows and I can have my things in there as well. But I'm in there with 3 other therapists who I really adore, I would say. I've worked with them, and actually I started being their supervisor in a variety of degrees. Clinical supervisor, which is different than like a work supervisor. It's where you supervise someone's clinical work. So after you graduate from school, you have to be supervised and you don't really practice independently until you have 4,000 hours of experience or something like that. 1,500 client contact hours. So there are 3 other therapists in there with me. And then we also have an office administrator that works on doing our billing and stuff. So I work primarily with couples, although I do also work with individuals. It's probably about maybe 30% individuals, 70% couples that I see. Mm-hmm. And this approach is really geared a lot more towards couples, although because of the traction it creates by having 2 people in the room and the way that the relationship system produces things naturally. Okay, which I can talk more about and probably will as we go forward. But basically, right now I go in and do telehealth because of the pandemic. Basically, I see probably 5 to 7 clients a day. Okay. Now I do a lot of 2-hour sessions because this approach works better with longer sessions, especially when you have 2 people, to be able to create the type of intensity it needs to move. Okay. That makes sense. And that took some time to build up stamina to do that, but now it's
that's a long day.
Yes. I prefer doing longer sessions, less people. So I used to see 7, 8, 9 people a day, for 1 hour.
Wow.
And so you'd be going back to back to back, and the whiplash of that and having to just reorient your mind to another situation was really stressful for me. Sure. And so, I would much rather see people for longer periods of time and be able to get more concentrated work in.
I agree with that. Even from teaching music, that same whiplash would happen. So I definitely
that makes sense that you would understand that dynamic.
Yeah, different ages and different instruments. It's totally different problems in front of you. So
another way that I see people, which is newer, is I got this directly from my mentor who really developed the primary aspects of this approach, is doing intensive couples therapy, which looks like doing 3-hour sessions 3 or 4 days in a row.
Oh, wow.
So there's a lot of reasons behind doing it that way, but the main one is that when you get into trying to produce brain change in people, having that kind of repetition and intensity are 2 very fundamental things in doing that.
That makes sense. And would that usually be is a one and done type of thing, comes to me for these few days,
yes,
can give you a new mindset?
It never ends. It could be, right? So you could get, theoretically, you can get enough in that to be able to take it forward and actually, if you really participated well in it, that you're going to have enough to be able to go back in your life and really put some of these things into action if you're serious about it. And you can kind of hear I'm talking about seriousness and if you really work at it, because there's something that happens a lot in therapy that I don't think people are very aware of, but a lot of people come in without really having the intention of working.
Gotcha.
So this happens a lot. Or if you think about couples therapy, it's probably not that unusual to think about how often one person is more motivated or might drag their partner in.
Yeah.
So, interestingly, oftentimes the person who drags the other person in is the person who's less likely to make a move oftentimes.
Interesting.
Yeah. But let me see if I can get back to my train of thought there.
Sure.
I don't remember how I was starting out with this. I was talking about people working in therapy, but there was a planning before that. Do you know what I was talking about?
It was your schedule. You were talking about.
You were talking about intensives. That's right. Intensives and whether it's a one and done type of thing. Mm-hmm. Most of the time, people do end up coming back. Some.
Is that after a while?
It kind of depends on the people. So every case is different. Yeah. So depending on what they're dealing with, some people are much more motivated after they come in and they need more help and okay, I see my problems more.
They see them go farther.
Yes, and it's we need more now. And then there are other people that are these problems are way worse than I want to deal with, and I never see them again. Wow. That's sort of my take on what's going on. Yeah, sure. And then I have some people that start out that way, and then they become more sort of regular clients, but they might meet every week for 2 hours until they sort of have enough to be able to move forward. The goal in this approach is different in some ways also than traditional therapy, where it's to try to get you functioning much better, quicker. So it's not something that where I'm going to be in psychoanalytical therapy for 3-4 years.
Right.
It's designed to get you doing better quicker. But there are some problems that are serious enough where you may have to be in therapy for a year or a little bit longer. Yeah, it depends on what you're really dealing with and how serious you are.
Sure, and you have to be flexible to all cases. Right?
Yep.
Yeah.
So that's sort of a typical day, is going in and seeing clients. And I have a paperwork day that I use where I'm actually working on reviewing mostly mental written dialogues, which is part of the approach. That is designed to help with sort of moving right brain pictures or traumatic material into your verbally accessible memory. So like converting your situationally accessible memory into your verbally accessible memory.
Oh, wow.
And also there's so many aspects of dialogues, but
sure.
The point I guess I want to make about that is that the approach I practice requires a lot of out-of-session time to really formulate the ideas about the case and to really dedicate time to help each person be able to move forward depending on the brain that they have.
Yeah. That's amazing. Thanks for that synopsis.
Mm-hmm.
And real quick, just make sure everything's recording because
okay.
I'm paranoid. And I'll just get that out of my brain. We're good. That looks good. Okay. Cool.
I'm glad you did that. Can you imagine at the very end?
Oh, it's happened. I just went on a podcast and I was supposed to be in his second session, but his first session they didn't record it.
Oh no.
Something happened. So, anyways, I just didn't want that. So,
I appreciate that.
Thank you. Yeah. A quick intermission. For my peace of mind. Great. No, that's awesome. And I even just learned a lot about what you do, even though I've known you for a while. So, cool. So this is called the Crucible Approach.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to ask first, I'd like to start with maybe why it's called that. Could be a good jumping in point.
Uh-huh.
And then also whether this was built on the back of something bigger or whether this was like a small seed of yours that you've grown.
Yeah.
I'd love to hear about that.
Okay, sure. So let me first say that the Crucible Approach, and then I'm not going to talk a lot about it, but further it's sort of been developed into something called Crucible Neurobiological Therapy, which is just moving more into sort of brain-based work with people. But so Crucible Approach is the theory that Dr. David Snarsh created, and he's the mentor that I've referenced. So I can say that most of the things that I work within are almost exclusively his approach. Okay. So the differences in what I do are only really sort of in my style and what I bring as far as my ability to make this approach relatable to the people that I'm working with. So, and then continuing to formulate things about people's brains outside of potentially what he may have thought of or what he was doing. That's something that I've been working on more now. But so the Crucible Approach was actually built off of a prior approach that is based, which is called natural systems theory. Okay. So natural systems theory is basically the idea that like all of nature, humans, plant life, everything is a natural occurring system. And that if you leave it alone, don't do anything with it, it will continue to develop. And that there was a theorist named Bowen, and he had somebody else that helped him named Kerr, that started to do some studies about this where humans are concerned. Mm-hmm. And for example, one of the main things that they did that was remarkable is they took a person who was schizophrenic, which is most of the time people regard that to be like a biological problem, like it's something with brain chemicals or like genetic. And I'm not saying there's not some of those components that contribute to it, but he started to study how the family unit impacted that and created that. And so schizophrenic people are typically like, if they have a psychotic episode or they're really in bad shape, get hospitalized individually. Well, he took them and their entire family and hospitalized all of them and studied them and started to understand better dynamics about what goes on in families and how people relate to each other. And a lot of things in the marriage and family therapy field are sort of stemmed off of this, where you start to look at relational dynamics of no aspect of it is linear. Like it's occurring within an emotional system, basically. Yeah. And so from that, they developed this concept called differentiation of self. Mm. And that is like one of the most fundamental aspects of Crucible Approach. Okay. So Crucible Approach I'll talk more about differentiation because it's very fundamental to it, but I believe your question was something along the lines of, where does this name come from, and was it built off of something? So it was built off of a prior approach. The name actually comes from, I always get metaphor and analogy confused, but it has two components of it that it utilizes. So a crucible, like in science, is basically an object used to heat substances and to melt them. So it has to contain a higher temperature. So if you're going to, actually, I just melted some in my silversmith class where I had to melt silver, and so we melted in the crucible, so it can sustain really high heat. Okay. And so you have that, metaphorically, that is utilized as what each person has to be able to do to change. So it's also the therapist's position in therapy. So in order to produce change in people, one of the ideas in this approach is that you have to be able to increase your anxiety tolerance and sustain a higher level of pressure to basically become something more.
That makes sense.
Yeah. So that happens within an individual. It happens within the therapist, is like the crucible, where you have to be able to manage yourself in a way where you don't start to do the things human beings do when they get overwhelmed.
Right. Okay.
So you have to contain it.
Okay.
And then the other aspect of it is that a crucible is like a journey. It's like a representation of like a difficult journey, like a crucible, in that kind of context and meaning. Yeah. So it fits in both of those ways, basically.
Okay. No, that makes sense. So like becoming a stronger container.
Exactly.
So that more momentous things can happen.
Absolutely.
Momentous changes can happen.
That's it. Yep.
Okay.
And it works for, if that's what happens with the person, that's what happens with the therapist, and you already can kind of see that one of the reasons this is a difficult approach to practice is that you have to be more developed than the people you treat.
Oh, I mean, that makes sense.
But one of the things that's interesting about it is most therapists are not.
Interesting. You would say most.
Most, yes. And I have to tell you, and I'm not afraid to say that, maybe a little tentative because I'm saying that. Therapists, I treat a lot of them now because I've been practicing a long time, and so I've sort of developed a reputation for having the approach is very direct also. Okay. They are the most difficult people to treat. Therapists. Hands down. Yes. Wow. They're fantastic at being able to work around things. You have to think about, they spend all day long like learning people's brains and covering their own.
Sure.
And so, and they're really good at looking that they function well.
Yeah.
And their therapists are really no different than their clients. They're humans. They all have their own trauma, and most of them aren't taught to pay attention truly to their own functioning and how it relates to where they can take their clients.
Wow.
So your own anxiety tolerance limitations with your intimacy capacity, which I'll talk more about later, really have a direct impact on what you can do with people.
That makes sense. What do you think happens when you're not actually developed past where your clients are? Does it just stay stagnant?
Yes, because you can't take them past your level. So
you
whatever.
Could, maybe accidentally make progress, but not really.
No, oftentimes therapists end up doing a lot of harm.
Really?
To be honest.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I would believe that actually. If that's.
Well, here's what typically happens when you come couples therapy. Let's go with that. Okay. Most of the time, what you have happen is you have one person come in who's the complainant, and then you have the other person. Occasionally, you have two people who are pretty volatile and they're equally infuriated with each other. But most of the time, it's that one person's sort of the problem, the other person's pissed off about whatever's going on. Right? That person who's angry is used to typically steamrolling the other person. And that if you are not developed enough where you can tolerate, for example, somebody being angry with you, when that person comes in and wants to set up therapy in a way that asserts their agenda, you'll cave to their agenda. You have to be willing to take an independent view of the room. The client's not the expert on their life. And people who are used to running a marriage and a whole family for 20-some years, coming in basically trying to get you to take their perspective and pick it up, you have to be willing to say, absolutely not. I'm not running on that viewpoint. Right. And most therapists can't do that. Yeah. And some of these people are difficult to deal with. Okay, they are atrocious to deal with. When you start to get into some of the things that we understand about how messed up people's brains are, seriously, in society, and some of the stuff that people believe, that comes directly from people's families. Like, one of the things that I end up dealing a lot with is how people mess with reality to assert their agenda, and how commonly that happens in most people's homes growing up.
Sure.
And so
we see that on large scales now too.
Absolutely, it's much more obvious just how impaired people are, and how people commandeer reality all the time.
Wow.
And if you look at many caregivers, they do it all the time. They, like, a kid, how common is it for a kid to, like, see something going on and, like, be horrified by that, show that sort of mind to the caregiver shuts that down so quick. And then typically what happens in adolescence is adolescents are pissed off about this, much more vocal, usually more defiant, and they're usually right about what's going on. That's when all of that, conflict ensues. But the way that people back people up to get out of dealing with themselves, or having to really look at the problems that they've created. So.
No, that makes sense. And I'm thinking about the difficulty. I have friends with a lot of difficulty in finding the right therapist. One, in affording a therapist, that's a different topic. But but the idea of shopping around for the right therapist, and how hard it can be to find someone who I've heard examples of just like the therapist being actually upfront about, I actually cannot handle your stuff. Like, this is actually
that's better. Actually, most therapists will present to you like they can fix all of your problems, and I respect being in a perspective. I really don't know what to do with this. There's something to be said about
there's
that.
Gotta be, maybe there's a different person out there.
Yeah, or one thing I run into a lot, because I am pushing the edge of what people do, is I sort of work myself into problems I've never dealt with before. And so the way I handle that is I'm just open with the person about, I've never handled this before, and I don't know of anybody else, because a lot of these things are not typical that people work with. I don't know of anybody else I can send you to, but I am willing to work on this with you to see what we can come up with if you're willing to open your mind. I'll do it the best I can.
Yeah.
And I I'm appreciative of the way when clients open their minds truly, what it has taught me about being able to help other people.
That's awesome. And they can recognize you as a human as well, which is, I think, great.
Yes, that has been something.
A collaboration.
Yeah, that's been really hard for me to do, because I definitely have my own, like everybody, I have my own issues of wanting to, or feeling pressure to have to produce a result. And therapists in particular, they're supposed to be experts,
it's a
right?
lot of pressure on you. Yeah.
It is. But once you sort of let go of some of that, understand that people really don't need for you to know everything. I think they'd rather you be honest. And I've never seen anybody, when I've been upfront about that, get really skittish or think, I don't want to do this. I've never actually had that experience.
Well, there's actually been studies on trustworthiness. When someone admits their mistakes, you actually become more trustworthy. It's like, I will just show you that I'm not perfect.
I have to do that a lot in therapy too, because here's the other thing. In this approach, you have to be willing, like I mentioned, to take an independent view in the room. It's really required. And I have never had a case yet where my frame of the problem was the same as the client's. Ever. Yeah. There are some little pieces sometimes that, like, they're accurate about their partner, but they really, what they characterize as the problem is never the problem.
Wow. How absurd.
Like, I can tell you how regular it is, which is one of the reasons why people usually stay, because once I talk with them about it and it lines up, it makes sense, either people are going to settle down and start to realize, okay, maybe there's something that can be done here, or sometimes it's more than what they're willing to they're willing to deal with. They're not willing to bite off the more than they can chew here, which really, this is an approach where you always have to work like that. The therapist has to work like that, the client has to work like that, and most human beings want to feel comfortable before they make moves. Yeah. And that's not how life works.
Wow. One more quick question on that before we move on.
Sure.
So there's the ability to just contain pressure. You said in the individual, also in the room with the therapist. Would you also say that it's an environmental thing as well? Like, a person finding an environment that can contain the changes they need to make. Like, does this apply to that as well?
I'm not sure what you mean by
Are
that.
there environments that can be crucibles for change and environments that aren't?
I don't know about that. I haven't really thought about it as
Okay.
far as environment. Well, you know what? Let me say this, that there is a component of that, I guess, let me say this. So one of the things when we get to talking more about differentiation is that the family system that you're a part of, everybody's functioning at a similar level of differentiation, which is basically the measure that you utilize to understand functioning in this approach. And it's different than what people often characterize as functioning better. Like if someone is smarter or seems calmer or whatever, this is like people pair up at similar levels of this. So there are environments where people are all really poorly differentiated. And that's an environment that is not conducive to significant changes, because the lower the level of differentiation, the more that people maneuver anxiety onto the other members. Yeah. And so they are more skillful at decreasing pressure and circumventing the system. Okay. So I don't know if that really answers the question when you're saying environments, but like it's more the context of the people. So in therapy, that environment, like the therapist is supposed to be in a position where their functioning is higher in a way where all the attempts of the people to get the pressure off of them are ineffective. Right. And it kind of points it back to them. Absolutely. And so what happens typically is they point it at each other. Sometimes the couple will both point it at the therapist to get off of them. If you're doing your job well, the client will come for you at some point. Okay. What I mean by that is when there's nowhere else to go, usually people come for you. Gotcha. And then after you can get through that, then usually people settle down, because that's also sort of a test, honestly. Yeah. If you can tolerate that, and most of the time, a person's never encountered somebody like that, where like I can actually stay calm while you act nuts. And I use that language with my clients, by the way. So I know that it can be sort of it kind of looks bad when therapists call people crazy or nuts, but people act like that. That's human beings. I'm not talking about certifiable. I'm just talking about you're losing it and showing your worst self. And it's like a behavioral thing. Yes. Behavioral nuts. Yes. I'm not talking about it like they, need to be hospitalized. I'm saying, what do you look like when you get regressed, basically? Right. How ridiculous can you get? And that's a human being thing. There's not a human being that is immune from that. Yeah. So that's sort of why I talk about it like that, because the other thing about this approach that's important is it's really non-pathological in a sense, meaning that you talk very openly about the problems people have, but it's non-pathologizing in the sense that it looks at all human beings are like this. So when I'm talking about, even though I've explained what differentiation is, I'm talking about it as sort of a measure and a way of functioning that people, let's see, I just lost my train of thought on it again. Give me a second. Everybody is really pretty poorly differentiated is what I'm trying to say. So there's this sort of the more developed you get, the more you realize how much worse you are.
Do you think now is a good time to explain differentiation?
Yes, probably so, because I've talked a lot about it. Okay. I appreciate you doing that. Yeah. So differentiation is really this fundamental force in life that can most easily be described as the balance between individuality and togetherness. So, but I definitely feel like I need to expand some on that. So, there is a fundamental aspect of being human that pulls you to want to experience your own life in a way where you pursue your own interests and you get your own needs met, and that individuality piece. And then there's an opposing force that really wants connection with another person. And that differentiation is essentially growing yourself to be able to tolerate that balance better. And so the problems that come in relationships with all people this is the main theory, they are problems with that the person, the people are not willing to develop within themselves, that they are trying to circumvent the system. In the sense of, I'll give you some examples because it's easy to pull it together. In marriage, when people first get together, they are usually crazy about each other. And there's this, people will, commonly call it the honeymoon phase.
Right.
But typically what that's describing is people are in a real validative stance. Like most intimacy, when people think about that, is related to other validated intimacy, which means you open up, the other person says, oh, that's great. And then they tell you something of equal level and you feel really connected. And differentiation-based approach is more along the lines of what's called self-validated intimacy, which is where you're actually open with who you are and how that actually usually pisses people off, especially your partner. Like, let's say that, here's a common one, like being sexually attracted to other people besides your partner.
Sure.
That's a fundamental human being thing. Although a lot of people will tell you that's a terrible thing that nobody should have.
Right.
Okay, I have people come into treatment where you have somebody maintaining and wanting to control their partner's mind that they could have no sexual attraction to another human being.
Right.
That's one example of
if you were truly monogamous, I would be the only person that these.
Yes, yeah, and human beings are children that way, where they really want to be the one and only. Yeah, and that's just not realistic in any capacity. Now, there's differences between, I think, understanding people are going to have other attractions, and then like actually pursuing and having affairs and breaking the agreement that the couple has. And I'm not talking about that.
That's where.
But I will say this is one of the ways when I'm describing differentiation where affairs happen. Like really commonly, one of the main things that I treat are affairs and marriage. And so an affair is an example of a person poorly managing their own differentiation. So they want to have the exclusivity of their partner and control their partner's sex, right? And I'm talking about an affair the partner doesn't know about. I'm not talking about open marriages or polyamory or stuff like that. I'm talking specifically about typical, traditional, in the United States.
Like here's the agreement.
We're a monogamous couple, okay? So this person wants to be able to have the exclusivity and commitment of the marriage, and then they go and have an affair so they can pursue their own sexual interests. So you see the individuality component that they want to have, and then they have the exclusivity of the commitment that they want. And so most affairs in this frame are the lack of the person being willing to develop their own control system for managing that within themselves. Where you can start to develop a relationship where you're more open, and maybe if you're not having your sexual interest met, that you're not willing to actually risk something and actually move that, or maybe your partner's really, sexually closed off because they're insecure and they don't want to explore things, but you don't want to push them because they get really difficult with you.
Sure.
That you're like, okay, I'll just do what I want, not tell them, and then I'll have this too.
Right.
That's basically escaping the system that exists to help grow you. So differentiation is designed to help develop people also, because it's forcing you to have to work on the tension between these two forces.
Sure. So just to make sure that I have the actual term defined right, because you're saying a well-differentiated person is a healthy thing.
Yes, the more differentiated you are. Yes,
the more differentiated you are, the more you understand your own needs in relation to the other's needs.
It's not just understanding it. I'm glad that you're doing this because it's really hard to explain. So I appreciate you saying, well, this is where I can't quite firm it up.
And following.
Let me say it a little different. Okay. Being more differentiated is what allows you to love well.
Okay.
So meaning that you're able to care about another human being in a way where their interests are on par with yours. And that you don't also just set your needs aside and ignore your interests to defer to the partner. So it's the balance really of how do you have a self and really not at the expense of your partner. And most of the time what happens with people is that they will give away self or not develop it to try to, fulfill the more dominant partner, right? Or the other way around, where you have somebody who's like more self-centered and they are ignoring or don't care about the other person's needs and they do whatever they want. And like you can see how both of those two people need development to be able to, it's basically encompassing both sides within the person. What you see within couples most of the time is one person's like this and one person's like this. One person's more about their own interest, this person's accommodating.
Yeah.
You also have two people that are sometimes you have two really sort of selfish people and they're fighting that out. And then sometimes you have two really passive people and none of those are good as far as being able to.
So none of those are actually differentiated. So
correct.
It's a balancing.
That's right.
Like an integration.
Yes.
I'm integrating my wants and in respect to yours.
Yes.
As well.
Okay. And the thing about that that's so difficult is that when you start to actually allow those dilemmas to surface, they create tremendous anxiety.
Sure.
One reason is that you have to, you have to start to look at, okay, if I want to do this, then it may be taking away from what that person wants. And that's what I mean about loving well, is that you have to start to, most of the time people don't even want to think about this because they have to give something up potentially. This is when you have to start basically dealing with the realities of life, and that's that you can't have all your needs soothed and fulfilled all the time if you're going to be in partnership. That's not the reality of how life goes. There's no easy answer a lot of the time. But people work really hard to avoid those types of things. Like right now I have a couple where the husband moved here for a job, met the wife here. She said that she would be willing to move back at some point in time where he's from, but really didn't mean that. Gotcha. She's very close to her family, doesn't really want to move. And these two came into therapy fighting this out where they really they have their different ways of fighting it, but both of them want to have what they want and act like they care about what their partner wants to. But they don't. And so a lot of the work I've been trying to do is to help push this balance of you cannot have what you want without taking something away from your partner, and that's part of marriage. But you ought to really start to dig in and talk about this and try to work through the difficulties. And they really do everything they can to avoid even coming to terms with it. And a lot of times they will just they won't deal with it for months, and then we'll do this huge eruption. Gotcha. And it's just really, they sort of refuse to actually do the work around, well, in some ways they've been getting a little bit better, but around really look at what your partner's mind and what you're asking them to give up. And then if you really do that, maybe then you can decide to make some sort of arrangement or actual compromise here. The truth is most people don't compromise. They really don't have the capacity to do that because you have to be pretty well differentiated to actually truly compromise with another person.
Gotcha.
So
that makes sense.
It does?
I think so, yeah. Okay. Yeah, it's the only reason it's confusing is because differentiation can sound, it can sound like the opposite of integration. Like if I'm a differentiated person, that feels not cohesive. Yeah. But I think it's just a linguistic thing because
I'm glad you're bringing that up.
Root,
yes,
so
because
it can be counterintuitive.
Yes, I'm so glad you're bringing that up because it's been so long since it was first introduced to me. I used to have that problem. People, anytime I would tell them about that, they would get confused that differentiated means separate because that's sort of it's distinguished from something else. If you
had to guess what the word meant, never having come to terms with
it, that might be. And it does mean that in some contexts, but as a theory here, in a way of being, it means the balance of the two.
Cool. Okay.
Yeah, a lot of people will start to say, I'm differentiated, when it's no, you're just being selfish. You're not really you're just doing what you want and calling that something developed. That's not the same thing.
Right. Okay.
And also the other thing is that people will act differentiated when they don't need people. And that's not a differentiated stance. I'm independent type of thing. Mm-hmm. And this is really about your capacity to make significant contact with another human being.
This is a relational.
That's right. This is with yourself and with another person and other people in your life. So if the more that you improve at this, the more that your relationships they're better balanced. You don't take things so personal from people, but you also hold them accountable in a way that's more serious at the same time. And you can think about that. Yeah. So there's all kinds of different aspects that sort of can describe a poorly differentiated stance versus a well differentiated stance. But I do want to be clear. Sometimes when we talk about it, it can sound kind of elitist, and the reality is that everybody is very low when it comes to differentiation. That it's not something to really be ashamed of or embarrassed of. I don't talk to people about it like this in therapy. Right. I talk about some of the aspects of, how to balance it, but I don't say, oh, you're really low, totally differentiated. I don't talk about it like that.
No, that makes sense.
Because it's so normal. What I'm saying, that's the non-pathologizing thing I was trying to talk about. This is human beings. This is how we function.
for me, falls under the category of fringe emotional skills.
Can you explain what you mean?
Yes, I'll explain what you
Okay.
mean. So, like, I mean, it's, would you say it's a skill? Or like,
it's both.
or is it's something that you can improve upon?
Yes.
Right?
So I will talk about, there's actually, one thing I will just explain in a minute is there are 4, like the mentor that I have talked about, he actually developed these things called points of balance, 4 of them, to help you develop your differentiation. And that helps make it more concise. But yeah, so there are skills you can develop within it that develop you to basically a more developed person. But yeah, part of it is skill development.
Okay, and so maybe like those things I would call fringe, because how long did I go in my life without anybody really explaining to me an ideal? I mean, we get there. Like, I mean, we all seem to have an idea of that is what the perfect functioning person would do, is be able to respect themselves, know their partner, be able to talk about their issues honestly and to move forward. Like, we all get a sense that would be like the ideal, but I say it's fringe because you're not given a handbook, you're not given a textbook. Mm-hmm. Even when we study psychology in school, high school or college, they're not really so much giving you practical relational skills. So like, you have to learn this pretty much through therapy, or by really truly caring about it yourself. And you probably won't find the right words.
Right.
So just what percentage of the population is actually thinking about these things? So that's why I say it's fringe. To even know that there's 4 skills that I could work on to be a better differentiated person. Yeah. But I still, I'm sitting here with you, and I still don't even know what those are. I could ask, but like, that's a very deep dive. That's a very specific deep dive. That's what I mean.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
It is. Well, one of the things that you made me think of is that the sort of the common viewpoints on relationships, although there is some movement out of this a little bit when you look into, relationship coaching or newer theories, but what David Snarsh would call the predominating view of what people want in relationships is the fusion fantasy, which is like this idea, and this is sort of the younger you go back, the more you can identify typically with this viewpoint of relationships. It's this idea that you're going to sort of find somebody that completes you as a person, and that they're going to be able to fulfill you in ways that you never had, or they're going to sort of fill in the gaps of the things that your parents didn't do for you, or that you start to develop this sort of idea of what the other person's going to fix in you or make up in you. And people don't necessarily think about it like that. They just think of, I'm going to find like the perfect person for me. And the reality is that I think more in differentiation, it basically goes off the idea that most of the time that's not actually conducive to adult love relationships. Like finding someone to soothe you where you can't soothe yourself, for example. That attachment is a very real thing. There's a lot about attachment theory as far as kids go, but differentiation therapy is very different from the predominating therapy models because most of them operate under trying to focus adults to fill in the gaps for each other. And differentiation is more one of that. You need to work on developing yourself so that you can lend a helping hand to your partner. So you can actually be a solid person who can be available. And everybody has limitations with that, but most of the time people don't want to even look at that, where they're lacking in their own development. They're pissed off at where their partner can't do it for them. And they usually have some reason for that, but they're not looking at where are you not holding up your end of the bargain with the other person as well. Yeah. So this is sort of pushes away from this idea that, if your relationship is going well, that the other person's supposed to be making you feel great all the time. Right. That's not real. And they're not, and the expectation of it is the fusion fantasy. This idea that and people oftentimes think that their relationships are going bad when they're fighting in conflict and when they're having sexual problems, which, by the way, is very important. That it's not a matter of if you're going to have problems in your sexual relationship, it is when will it happen? What's it going to be? And so people often feel really terrible and like wanting to blame their other person, or they are blaming themselves. And most of this stuff is just normal things that happen in context of relationships, partner relationships in particular, over time.
Sure.
And it's basically pushing on the people to develop. And it does it all on its own. So therapy really is designed to help expedite that or push people where they don't want to deal with something. But usually the partnership does all that on its own to an extent. It just sort of helps it happen faster, or compresses it in a way that creates movement. Yeah. So even if people don't ever go to therapy, the natural system is working on them. Differentiation is working on the person. Anytime your partner wants to do something that you don't want to do, it's right there. And how are you going to handle that? Are you going to act like you care about them and then you do what you want anyway? Are you going to do what they want at the expense of you all the time? It's in every interaction that you can think of. So
that's true. And so people that, the longer term, the longer you're with somebody and you're in that, let's say boundary, I guess, in that decision, in that commitment, that you're right, like just from the proximity and consistency that you're running into those little problems. I don't mean problems as in like this is a true problem, but like more like a puzzle. Like, we don't perfectly match right now. Like, oh my gosh, we're not the perfect other halves to each other right now.
Yes.
Every time that comes up in between you, that is an opportunity for growth.
That's right. You got it.
Okay.
And really, the problem is not in that. The problems come from when people try to avoid it.
That makes sense. So the real problems are when you're not looking at the puzzles.
Or you're not, or even if you're not doing, you don't want to do anything about it. Sometimes people aren't looking at it, but most of the time, people are aware of this. At the very least, people are, like in this theory, there's lots of different sort of ideas, but one of them is that you can track other people pretty well. Mm-hmm. The more difficulty, I need to see. My nose is running a little bit. More of the difficulty comes from not being able to see yourself clearly, not tracking yourself. So mind mapping is a concept that is very a part of this model. So mind mapping is really the way that this is the term that Snarsh coined around being able to get sort of a mental picture of someone else's mind. And I'm not talking tangibly. It's like understanding what they're after, and that communication is going on all the time. You cannot not communicate. I'm not even just talking about body language or glances. I'm talking about understanding what motivates the person that you're with. Understanding things very subtle, like they cooked dinner just so that you can tell them that they're happy, or that you're happy with what they did. That it's not even about cooking for you. Or like this sort of dynamic that happens a lot where people are acting really selfless, like they care about you, but it's really to get your feedback about how great they are. That plays out all the time in marriage. But that's an example of mind mapping where you can track what the other person is doing. And they might be aware that they're doing that. Sometimes they're not.
Right.
So you can see how that can play out problematically, like sexually speaking. This comes up quite a bit where, you have a couple that presents with, let's say, I'm going to use a sort of stereotypical gender scenario here too, where you have like a heterosexual couple, but this plays out in all couples. It doesn't matter what your gender is. I work with transgender clients, non-binary clients. I work with everybody. And so, but this dynamic, let's say that the woman comes in and she doesn't want to have sex, she's low sexual desire, and this can get characterized all kinds of ways. But I can tell you one problem that often comes up is that the partner understands that let's say that the husband's view of himself is contingent upon how she responds sexually, like whether she has an orgasm or not, or whether she's actually turned on, and how much effort she needs to put forth to, let's say, prop him up, make him feel a certain way. And that kills sex, especially after a period of time, let's say in this role that I'm saying that the wife is in, she's, not going to want to do that, where she understands this is not about me. I have to put on a show for you. Right. And that's an example of some differentiation problems. We have, in this case, the husband is really dependent on validation to feel a certain way, and he wants to squeeze that out of his partner. And oftentimes this will present like sometimes the wife is mad, but oftentimes he'll present like there's something wrong with her. And sometimes the wife will act like she's got some sort of problem, like with sexual abuse or something, to avoid having to deal with what the real issue is. So I know I'm getting a bit more digressive into some of the specifics here, but I'm saying this presents in so many different ways where you have to really try to understand what's going on. And that is really off of figuring out the mind mapping of the people. What's actually happening? You have to picture this in your head and think about, how do human beings work? What really happens in relationships with people? Not what they tell you. You cannot go off of what they say. You have to dig in like a detective in a sense, where you really have to go off of data and generate hypotheses and get down to the root of the real problem, and then produce the pressure for people to start to deal with this.
Okay, and you're saying mind mapping is like, would you say it's more just of something we naturally do? Or
Yes.
Do you also say it's a tool?
Absolutely. It is survival based.
It's survival.
So even if you don't have like dogs have mind mapping ability.
Okay.
And so even if you don't have really, like, let's say even people that have like developmental disabilities, so it's not a cortical function, although you can utilize your prefrontal lobe to refine it, but it exists more in the limbic system, which is really designed to help you snapshot, is this a safe person or not?
Interesting.
And it's gotten more developed as human beings evolve, and so you can start to really track subtleties. And this is something that most 4-year-olds have, that you can watch it play out, where they understand, if I do this, this is how mom responds, this is how dad responds, this is how I get them to be happy with me. That's a picture of someone's mind. And this is happening all the time.
You're saying they have that picture of your mind,
yes.
And they're acting a certain way to get a certain response.
Absolutely. And so to be a good therapist in this approach, you have to have really good mind mapping ability, and you have to also understand how human beings actually function, not how they pretend they are.
That's big.
Mm-hmm. Very big. And here's the other thing. That's right. And here's the other thing about it. You have to put pressure on people who want to maintain false pictures of themselves about who they are.
And do you think, how often do you think a person accurately has their own mind map? Like if when somebody's pretending, like do they actually believe they're pretending?
Occasionally. So you're getting into some of the more specifics, and this is really what sort of bogs therapists down to, is that first of all, you can learn how to track this so closely that you can, like, one of the things that really helps as far as if you're going to do your job well, is you have to do a really tight, close brain therapy, which is that and I'm even talking to you like this and showing you sort of when you say something, that I'm tracking it and really paying attention to, did what you just say actually line up with the picture that I have of what's going on, or are you trying to implant an idea in my mind to divert me off of your tail, And that you can get that good where you can, really gather, does this picture hang together in a way? And so most people are pretty off about themselves. There are people who are a little better at it. If they're like, one of the things, and I'm sure you know, because we've been friends for a while, I know this is characteristic of who you are, which is actually a very unusual characteristic in a human being. You seem to care about feedback from people, that you're open to it, okay? This is not common, and it's not common in therapy, which is really bizarre. This took a lot of getting used to on my part, because I thought
that's why you
that's
go
right.
to therapy.
That's where I'm going with this, right? Like, people will come in and get furious about what I'm saying, and I have to say things like, maybe you forgot I'm the therapist, And I do use a lot of humor and sort of, like, I get pretty tough with people, but I also sort of joke with them in a way of, like, to sort of say, like, you're acting crazy, that you're coming into therapy and you're acting like you really don't want to know what I think, and you really don't. But that's what you're paying me for. Right. It's an outside perspective here.
Yeah.
And so people are off about themselves more than they're off about their partner. And that's one of the things that's interesting about how couple relationships develop you. If you're open to your partner's feedback, they're giving you useful information about where your problem.
It's a huge source of wisdom.
Absolutely, if you use it that way.
Yeah.
That's right. But here's the other thing that's difficult. There are people, one of the things in this approach that's really important, that's very hard, I think, for the general population to tolerate, is just how dark human beings are. Yeah. And that it's normal for people to have a lot of dark traits like being sadistic and being narcissistic, or even having like sociopathic traits. Or I'm just talking about traits. I'm not talking about full blown. Okay, but that people come from homes where a lot of bad stuff happens. I'm not talking about just these really horrific abuse situations. I'm talking about normal homes. And so they come out of there learning the stuff that their family did to avoid dealing with themselves, and basically attending to their own wants, needs, desires. The caregivers is what I'm referencing now. And then people grow up and they develop those same type of characteristics, because your brain, when you map caregivers' minds, develops that kind of thinking pattern.
So you developing a mind map of somebody else's mind is actually also kind of building your own, or has the potential to?
Absolutely. So here's one of the things that can be very upsetting, is that all you have to do to develop a characteristic is to map it in your caregiver's mind.
Really? Like, I mean, that makes sense. I'm saying really, like, no way, but it's like...
There's a lot of things in this theory like that where it like sort of blow your mind. It's like, well, of course that makes sense, but it still like it hits you in a way where it's like, oh shit.
It's because you feel like you're able to be separate. Like, we tend to feel like if we're observing it, that it has nothing to do with us. Right. But actually, that is like proof that it has something to do with you.
Absolutely. Well, the brain wires on repetition, and how many times do you have to, like, here's an example of like, okay, you don't have, like, this is what's confusing for a lot of people. They'll come in and they'll report really great childhood. They had a very normal childhood, like great childhood, and you start to talk about their caregiver's mind, you start to learn things like, wait a second, like, this is, even the way the person relates to themselves, like, let's say that you had a mother who was really, had body image issues and was really obsessive about what she ate, or was never happy with herself. Well, what do you learn from that, right? You have the possibility of learning, you should never be happy with how you look. Right. And if you keep mapping that in the mother's mind, then what are you supposed to learn about how satisfied you should be with yourself? And like, say you have like a really rigid father who focuses all the time on like money, okay? Even if you don't want to think about that, you could find yourself feeling bad about the fact you aren't doing it the way that he thinks it should be done. But you can, so when people start to talk, you can understand who their parents were.
Yeah. Wow.
And so if you spend enough time with people, and this is one thing that gets people sort of hooked on therapy, is when you can see how their mind works and you can tell them about their parents, usually they're hooked at that point. They're like really spooked out about like, how could you possibly know that? And it's science. Yeah. And so, the good news is you can rewire brain patterns. The bad news is a lot of work.
Absolutely. Well, and that's so big right there. Like, people don't realize how much repetition, like the things that we don't give a second thought to, are some of the things that we've actually been exposed to on repeat for years.
That's right.
Like if you were in, with your caregivers until college, that's almost 2 decades.
Yes.
Of their behavior. So
that's another thing people are often. What you made me think about something that people are often off about when they come into therapy, which people will sort of have this picture of like their problem is like the absent parent. It's pretty common to have people that have like maybe their dad was never around or the mother abandoned the family or something like that, and they'll be really sort of hung up on the parent that was absent, that had a really big impact on them. But one of the sayings, again, from my mentor was that you should be more concerned with the love you got than the love that you didn't get.
Wow.
Because that repetition is what creates brain problems. It's not that there's no impact in an absent caregiver, but it's nothing close to what kind of problems are going to show up from the person that was around.
Wow. I had never thought of that.
There's all kinds of things like that within this theory that are just like, they stun you. And that's one of the, you can hear when I'm talking about it, I get so excited and get sort of lost in it because it really organizes and makes so much sense when you look at how relationships really work. And there's like really nothing I've found like that. So when I was in grad school, there's lots of different theories that are practiced. Like I would say probably just in grad school, I probably learned about 15. And this was the only one that was like oh yeah, this is serious. Like, it really hit me, and I could see myself in some of the things, like in the books I read about it, where some of the shit that I would pull, like really like, oh, what's, like, it was so honest in a way where, like, a lot of the other theories are much rosier.
I was going to ask what stood out about it.
Yeah, like one therapy in particular that's sort of counter to this one really focuses on just like emotions and feelings, and a lot of therapies like that. And this approach sort of takes the idea, which sort of makes people bristle at first, that feelings are not the most important thing. Which is not to say they're not important. It's just saying that, like, if you feel something, that doesn't really entitle you to do whatever you want. And people operate that way in relationships all the time. Well, I was mad, so I can act like that. Or I was really hurt. That's why I cheated. Like, that's not the most important thing if you're trying to get a relationship to work.
Right. It's like a following her type of...
Yes. They're very important, but they're misused a lot to cover up lack of, I think, accountability with oneself.
Okay. Yeah, sure. So, so far, to just kind of backtrack with the trail we've gone through on the Crucible Approach, the main points we talked about are, like, what it is, why it's called that. Being able to contain pressure, contain temperature, so that you can change within it.
Yes.
Okay. And then it has components so far that I'm getting, which is like mind mapping is a component of it.
Yes, absolutely.
The
differentiation
is a component. Correct. You would say.
I'd say that's probably the most fundamental component of it is differentiation.
Okay.
Mind mapping is a component of it in that it helps you understand what's actually going on with it. Partnership, and it has to be established in therapy early on so that you can start to deal with what's going on. As people try to lie and avoid mind mapping, they try to act like they don't have the ability to understand. Like in the case of like saying something like, well, I didn't know you felt that way. You didn't tell me. We have a communication problem. That's one of the most common complaints, but typically that's not the issue. That is something that is utilized and it happens in all human interactions, and it's a component of the therapy because it helps you get down to the root of what's really happening. Okay. So yeah, differentiation is fundamental growth sort of aspect that is at the root or like the foundation of the theory, and then as you move that, mind mapping is a core component of that. Okay. What other components are we missing? I'm sure we are. That you feel like are important. Let me actually, because I know I took some notes on here just to make sure I didn't miss some of these things. There are the 4 points of balance that help you understand differentiation, but I would so there's that aspect we can go into. Another component is alliances, so I can talk about that. Yeah, whichever ones are the main, like right under the umbrella. Okay. Yeah. Alliances are under the umbrella. So is gridlock, I would say. But alliances are, so one of the sort of goals that you shoot towards or work with people on is developing their ability to operate within a collaborative alliance. And some of the aspects of, there are really 3 types of alliances that are identified in this approach. And one is collusive alliance, which is, sort of how it sounds, where basically people are agreeing to not deal with the problems that but all the alliances are agreements, all right? Because a combative alliance is an agreement to fight. And there are a lot of, when couples come in, typically they alternate between collusive and combative alliance. So most relationships, the lower the differentiation, the more common this is, that people ignore their issues. They don't want to deal with the serious things going on. And then, maybe at some point something big happens or something builds up and then they're in a fight and now they can't stand each other. And then they don't ever really deal with the root of that. And then they just go back into being collusive and sort of, the longer people are married, the more they have that pattern, because some people are just straight up collusive. They never ever fight about their problems, or really, there are people that will have, seriously, someone will be having an affair for a decade and the other person knows about it and they're not happy about it, but they don't ever fight about it. That's a collusive alliance. Want the conclusion of that. Right. For whatever reason. And there's a lot of different reasons why a person might not bring that to it. Yeah, sure. But, Combative alliances are interesting in that you can have a combative alliance and it not really look that way. Just meaning that you can tell, like when people are mad at each other and fighting, there's a lot of ways that can look. Like withholding is an example of that, right? Or just being passive aggressive or that type of thing. And so you have to be pretty careful about looking at that. So collaboration, and it's related to differentiation in the sense that it's working you to be honest even when it's personally disadvantageous to you. So that's, you can see the balance there, and that you're gonna be who you are and be forthright even when it's hard. And I'm not talking about just brutal honesty for the sake of that. I'm talking, yes, like when something's going on with you that you know the other person would want to know, and that's where mind mapping comes in, right? Yeah. Like a lot of times people will say, well, I didn't know that she wanted to know this, or I didn't know that he expected this, when they absolutely know that.
Right.
That's why mind mapping is an important fundamental thing. So once you establish that, people can't use that to work around as much. Cool. Again, that's one strategy to contain the pressure and compress the couple or the individual. But you also, as a therapist, have to be able to work within a collaborative alliance with your clients, which is very, very hard to do because you're trying to model something for one.
Right.
Yeah. But, like, it's really hard not to be collusive and combative.
Right. Like, so, we don't have to go there.
Yeah,
you're right. We can do these.
People work all the time to try to induct you into the alliance they're comfortable with.
Right.
Yeah. So people will come into therapy and really try to, in very subtle ways, I'm telling you, get you to set it up where it's harder for you to tell them the truth. There will be people who will, like, start to be crying and get really indulgent in some of their traumas in a way to get you to not talk directly to them. For example, they want you to be collusive with them. There are also people that really try to piss you off. So you get mad and you start to fight with them. And you have to, it's so much work. And I can honestly tell you, I have messed that up so many times.
So they pull you into their home court advantage.
Yes, and then I also want to be clear, you have your own shit you bring into it as a person, right? So I have all of the home I grew up in, and the ways that all those people related. I can't think of any relationship that was collaborative. And that's true for most people. They don't come out of places where they have that. Maybe they have little tiny bits. A lot of people will come out thinking that they have that and want to operate like that. It's nothing like that. It's like a collusive alliance. Nobody ever tells anybody the truth. People just let things go by. There are people who have to sacrifice themselves entirely to keep the dynamic going.
Wow, yeah.
So yeah, that's another aspect that's so hard on the therapist, but you're trying to work with people to deal with themselves more honestly in that sense. So yeah, you want to work people towards collaboration, and collaboration is sort of the underpinning of developing trust, which takes a very long time.
Okay, that makes sense. So under alliances is collusive, combative, and collaborative.
Correct.
Alliances.
Yes, those are two. There's lots of fundamental things, but those come up a lot.
An alliance with somebody is just something you have by default by just being in a relationship with
I'm
them.
glad you bring that up. Yes.
And then it's like, what type of alliance?
Exactly. There's no way you cannot not be in an alliance.
Right.
With another person. It's just what's your style?
Nice. I think there's some. Again, this could be for a different conversation. Like, doesn't have to be dove into here, but I think that is relevant in a lot of even today's like greater societal relationships, like the big picture zoomed out relationships.
Absolutely.
To just rather than this perception of, okay, this group of people is like my enemy, they're actively working against me. These kinds of people are my allies. There's allies and enemies. It's like, if you're in the same system, you actually are an ally by default. Now, what kind of alliance are you using as these problems show up in front of you? Like, I can definitely see how this is applicable to a lot of things.
Everything.
Yeah.
Like, when you start to look at these concepts, there's no way to not be doing it all the time. And so to me, it's a very helpful frame to look at, okay, if I want to relate better as a human being, how do I do that? And like some of the things you're talking about, this happens so much in political structure, where, the way that we obviously have it set up here in this sort of two opposing forces where you have within that, and you have these two sides essentially where, if you're on the right side, it's like, that's a good example of differentiation too, in the sense of that a person who can manage difference in another person is a more differentiated person, that you can hold your values. And part of developing is that your values are well thought out, they're important to you, but you also have this ability to take on new ideas and try them on. You don't change easily, but you're willing to. You're not so, dogmatic in your approach, or that you, like, that's a very fundamental aspect of differentiation. But if people were more collaborative, this would go a lot better.
Oh, yeah, this, like, capital T, this. Like, this would be going better.
Yes, exactly. One thing that comes out that I think a lot about for, there's so many issues that have come to the forefront that have always been around in our society. In the last year, so much has, like, been thrust in the forefront. But some of the things that are coming more to light about, I think with people of color and, systemic racism, and one of the things that goes on that's a problem, I think, is that most white people can't be collaborative. They're very brittle, and they're not willing to learn by, I think, being called out. Okay, so collaboration is telling someone when they've got an outline, or that they're saying or doing something that's problematic.
You're kind of saying, hey, this relationship is not right now.
Yeah, or what you're doing right now is a problem.
Yes, right.
Yes. So, like, one of the common things I see is that a person of color will make a statement about something that they have experienced that is a problem, some sort of prejudice or oppression or something by white people.
And speaking up about that is actually collaborative.
That's absolutely right. Yeah, yes. They're saying, this is something I experienced, this is a problem. And then undoubtedly, within a very short period of time, you will have, like, almost always a white person, often women, will come on and say things like, I don't know why you have to be so rude about it. She was just trying to understand something, or something like this. Like the inducing the problem that already exists, like that you're supposed to cater your truth to someone else's feelings. There's an example of how feelings are most important, and it's basically reinforcing the problem that's within the system. But it's also bidding for a collusive alliance that you're supposed to, because of collusive
you're
alliance,
saying, hey, we were supposed to not be talking about this.
Yes.
Like, that's how I wanted this alliance.
Or that collusive alliances operate on making people feel certain ways. In this case, like, I want for you to cater to how she feels, than for you to be able to talk about a basic human right, or something that's happening. Her feeling is more important than your truth. Absolutely. And then there's the system inducted again about systemic racism and the privilege and all that stuff. And people white people absolutely feel entitled to that.
Yeah.
And and a lot of people do. I'm not saying it's just a problem within,
But that's a really good example. That's a great example.
It comes out in that all the time. And so, most of what I see, and I can see a lot of, it is true that, a lot of people of color can be combative, but most of the time that's not what I see. And I honestly think that if they're going to be, I still think we should listen, because I honestly think they're entitled to be furious as hell. I think we're lucky they don't. When they get revenge, they just want equality.
Well said.
Yeah.
Well said.
So that's an example of collaboration, and why people don't tolerate it well. People don't like being made to get once you get a reflection that's more accurate about who you are, if you're not accustomed to that kind of confrontation, usually you crumble. And in this therapy, it's like trying to build people to be more resilient.
Yeah, because it's pretty weak.
It's extremely weak.
It's really weak.
It's fragile, weak, brittle. Yes, and that's so much of what I'm doing in therapy with people, because most of the time in couple relationships, people are mad that the other person will operate within their anxieties and their insecurities. And so that really limits intimacy. It kills sex when people can't be open and they can't deal with their insecurities, and they expect the other person to live within that. And so that's something that pushes differentiation forward too, where you're developing more of a solid self, and you need less feedback from people to feel like you matter, that and you can accept your limitations better. It's not like you have to avoid them because you can't look at them. You can accept them in a way you start to grow.
That makes sense. Well, and you were talking about, for me, just to make it personal for a second, like just how much that I do look for feedback, and it's not because I like it. Like it's this kind of pursuit of strength because I kind of hated the weakness I saw in myself so much of like fragility in my relationships. How if something was called out, just the extent to which I could not handle truth, and the amount of conflicts that I ran away from instead of trying to collaborate with people was getting in the way of the health of my friendships and relationships, and does still. So like this feedback is like an active. My friend used a good word today. It's a fight against the gag reflex, my friend said.
Oh, I like that.
He said, I know this about myself, and that's why I go do the opposite of what I want, because I know I need to be stronger this way. I know my weakness. And it's been trying to grow out of ways that I'm tired of seeing myself be, is that feedback. I just haven't put it in those words before, but...
I'm happy to hear you say that. You're like the type of client I would love to have, even though I'm happy we're friends. Okay, so like you can't be my client, but there are some people, it's not very common, who are really growth minded, and when they get a glimpse of someone in themselves, they want to do more and they're willing to do hard things and face anxiety, because one of the things you're talking about that's fundamental to growth and increasing your differentiation is that you confront things that make you afraid. And it is a normal human thing to want to look away from feedback about yourself that you don't like. But if you want to improve and become less fragile, you do have to walk into that. And it's true that everybody has problems with that. There's absolutely things that I still avoid when I look at, or I will cut myself in it, and it's very hard. But the more you do it, you do become more resilient and you become more trustworthy. And this is one of the things about learning to love well, which is that one of the problems that happens in relationships so often is that the other person drops their end of the alliance because they can't be there for you as soon as you show them something they can't stand in themselves. So if you reflect back something about to them, right, that they can't tolerate, they're going to bail on you. And then you start to feel that you're going to have to deal with, you have to soothe your own self in that. Most of the time what happens is you feel wounded, you drop your into things too, all bets are off, and then it's a shit show. And that's one of the things I try to work with people on, is that how do you become resilient and being collaborative when your partner temporarily drops their into things? And that doesn't mean everybody gets to do whatever the fuck they want.
Right.
In a lot of relationships, that's exactly what it means, because people grow up in homes like that all the time.
Like, we're not in this agreement anymore. I guess all agreements are off.
Yes, and people, the more hypersensitive you are to somebody else dropping their end of things, the more likely you are to drop your end.
Interesting.
So there's something about noticing when someone drops their end, and a collaborative way of handling that is to, first and foremost, this is a really important thing about collaborative alliances I can't believe I forgot to say. The first person that you check is yourself. Every single time. Okay. So as soon as you notice somebody has dropped their end, what you need to do immediately is look at whether you have to. So the first person that you always look at is yourself. And it's really hard to do whenever you're angry, to get a viewpoint of like, wait a second, let me rewind this. And that's one way I use dialogues too, is I will write out conversations in the best way I can remember about what I said, what they said, and I'll try to look at it like third person and see, okay, I dropped my in there too. Or, no, I think I did a pretty good job in this talk, right? Yeah. But once you check yourself and make sure that you are being collaborative, then you need to talk to the other person about where they drop their into things. To not deal with that, especially when it's really important, is elusive. And the longer that goes on, the more you're headed for, you're going to get walked all over, or it's going to blow. And it's the longer it goes, the more it's going to blow. And then,
that makes sense.
Yeah, really. So,
first person checks yourself, but remember to check both people.
Yes,
do it in order, because
that's right.
Because I know people that will only check themselves and pretty much actually assume it's themselves every time, or the opposite.
That's right. Oh my gosh, yes. So, and that's often the people that pair up with each other, right? Like the person that's like, this is never me, and that's absolutely. And eventually, though, usually what happens is that you have the person who it's always their fault. They start to build some resentment, start to understand something about. Wait a second, this cannot always be me.
Right.
That's
the math is bad here.
That's differentiation emotion. Okay. That is starting to get to the point where you're like, no, and that actually leads me to one of the other concepts, which is gridlock. And gridlock is sort of a concept that makes sense, I think, just by hearing it, and it's not a term exclusive to this approach, certainly. Sure. But it describes the process of, let's say that example I was just using, where you have somebody who's always the one who's right and the other one's always wrong, where the one who's always wrong starts to get tired of this and realize they're not always wrong. And they start to not operate like that anymore, where let's say maybe they decide they're not going to have sex with their partner anymore if they're right all the time. And so then this starts to set, there's something in motion here where neither person will budge. And so the relationship, this is how most couples come in to therapy. They're in gridlock because it won't move. It's stuck.
Gotcha.
And usually gridlock is induced by somebody starting to grow.
Okay, interesting.
That's really important because people often see that as a huge problem, and typically it's a sign of things are starting to move. Now, they're not where you want them to be, and people can be gridlocked for a decade or something, and that's not good.
It's like things were moving a certain way, and it will keep moving that way as long as both people stay the same.
Right.
But like, who stays the same forever?
Right. You know what's interesting is how weak humans are as far as how long they'll, and how the multitude of ways they'll try to escape their own anxieties to change. Like the collusive dynamic of neither of us are going to deal with this, but we're in gridlock. Like there are people that come in seriously that haven't had sex for 10 years, but they're married. Okay. And like, it's unbelievable to me personally, that you would be okay going without sex for 10 years. That's a concern to me, which I talk openly about.
It's just kind of like, I guess that's what a relationship is now, rather than
maybe, push the envelope.
Maybe something should change.
Yeah, and that's an example of a really low-level differentiated person, where they're willing to give up something that a person would think that's important. Oftentimes people dampen their desire.
Okay. Yeah.
So people know how to like not want. Like they can toy with that. Like not wanting to want is one way people avoid dilemmas.
That makes way too much sense. But yeah.
So there's lots of different maneuvers and once you assess what's going on, there are different ways to apply pressure to people. But people who are not very developed don't have they don't experience much pain, the same level of pain as people who want, and that's a strategy, right? So you don't have to feel pain.
Suppress your wants.
That's right.
That's the passive.
Yes.
Is that the passive approach, would you say?
That is one. I don't know if I would call it passive, but
it's because it's like rather than keep wanting what you want and figuring out what has to change so that can still happen.
It's an avoidance of anxiety. Yeah. So it's a strategy to circumvent the system where life will start to again push you to be differentiated, where it will run you directly into, especially if you're in a relationship with somebody, this dilemma of I want something that the other person doesn't want to give me, or I want something that's too hard. This happens even in career where people like work a job that they hate forever, and they'll just sort of turn down the dial on what they're interested in, and so they doesn't hurt as bad. That's not understood. Yeah, they're not willing, like, because to be interested would create this scenario where you might have to go without income. You might have to go against what your parents think of you, or maybe you have a partner who doesn't want to work and you don't want to confront them about that, and you have to provide for the family or something like this. Like, there's so many scenarios where when you start to look at it, you would have to really increase your anxiety tolerance and say, I'm going to sort of get into a scenario where I don't know what's going to happen, and I'm willing to do it because I care more about me. But yeah, that's one common way people avoid having to confront anxiety, is just want less.
Would you say pretend to want less?
Actually, no. Yes. Okay. Like one of the things that's I think very this job that I'm in, one of the things that I've had to really develop is tolerating the pain of looking at just how impoverished some people's upbringings are. And I'm not talking about money. I'm talking about it's so painful that they're never going to get the thing that they want, that their brain starts to develop impairments to basically compensate for that. And that's something that I'm not going to talk a lot about today, but Crucible Neurobiological Therapy, which is basically the building off of Crucible Approach, it's more into specifics about you can really be trained to not be in contact with your desire. And if you want your parents to love you, for example, and they don't, or they don't care about doing anything on your behalf, like think about what that's like every single day to have to be faced with that. You're going to start to develop some mechanisms, and one way people deal with that is that they start to turn down the dial on desire. But it's a really motivating force. That's one of the reasons why when someone comes into therapy and have an upbringing like that, and that's how they cope with that. Therapist has to be able to track that and start to work within that system and bring something more effective online. And there's a lot of strategies to work on that, but starting to rewire something in the person's brain where they start to want like a typical person, because human desire can make people move mountains. That's really, when you want something so bad, that tension is what helps you develop. And so, that's just a circumvent of the system, unfortunately. And I'm saying some people do it on purpose and they try to ignore things and they can't. And then there are other people that they really are impaired in the sense that they can't even feel the way that a person should feel. And that's so upsetting to see. And I had a really difficult upbringing. Fortunately, I didn't develop that type of problem. I have a different problem where it's, there's different ways that I want everything, I feel like I have like the opposite problem. And so trying to learn how to manage that where I don't like force people to do things, or, I don't really want to get too far into that just because it's hard for me to actually talk about the other side of it, but I want to sort of stay with it a little bit more theoretically, but you can sort of even feel like the seriousness of this. When I start to talk with people about this, there's more about making contact with people. That's really important in this approach as well. So one of the things that happens in upbringings is that most people aren't accustomed to a person actually investing in a way where they make contact with who they are. And so I try to do that with people in therapy.
That's how.
Yeah, it's very common.
That's an interesting way to put it. Like, to come into contact with the way they actually are.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that's hard on the therapist, because a lot of people, who they are, is not good. They didn't come from a good place, and if you don't come from a good place, often you have a lot of characteristics that are pretty badass, and I don't mean in a good way. And so being able to connect with someone like that and keep yourself calm enough to meet the person sort of where they function and really understand that they could look better than they do, meaning they can function a lot better, is extremely hard. It's really challenging and taxing on the therapist's brain. And it takes a lot of resiliency. You have to build up resiliency to something called traumatic mind mapping, which is another component of the theory. There's so many, you can see, like, I don't know how long we've been talking now.
I'm not sure.
I could talk for 4 hours, maybe 5. I'm not going to do that to you guys, to anybody. It's heavy.
But I could dive in with you for hours as well.
How long have we been doing
about an hour and a half, probably.
We have?
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's 6 now. So, a lot of stuff.
I'm trying to think about, I know that we're sort of at about the limit, but there was one aspect of this I was hoping to be able to talk about that I think is really important.
Yeah.
I'm not going to talk about the points of balance, although I do think they're helpful if people are interested in them, but I just think for the sake of time, I'd like to sort of pick up on and again, this is a very sort of rough overview, so there's so much more to it, but hopefully it's enough for people to kind of get an idea.
Yeah.
So what I was starting to talk about there at the end relates to all of that is sort of relates to the last part, which has to do with the spirituality of the approach, which is really around pieces of helping people to love well and to make contact in more meaningful ways in their lives. And part of that is teaching people to increase their intimacy capacity, which intimacy capacity has a lot to do with how much can you come in contact with another person and actually open your mind. Like, I'm not talking about being open-minded and that you're okay with new ideas. I'm talking about you show them you. And most people believe that if anybody ever knew them really, they would not want to be close to them. So, again, most people don't have that kind of profound intimacy. So even if you have a family that's pretty loving, the caregivers have limitations in intimacy capacity. This is a developmental thing over time as well that a lot of people don't push. So you have about the same level of this capacity going out of your family that your parents achieved. You can achieve more with a lot of work over time, but you sort of come out of the chute like with their level. So if they're not very open and they're not willing to relate openly to themselves with their problems and all this sort of thing, and you're not going to be able to do that very well. Yeah. Again, relationships set it up where it's going to push that naturally. But it really also works on developing like a profound sexual relationship with people. So being able to make contact sexually and the spirituality of having that kind of connection is also something I work with people on.
So when you say spirituality, are you pointing towards meaningful, genuine personal connection?
Yes.
Like, are you just meaning just...
I mean something more than, in the sense of the word that it means there's something more to life, and that this is it. Like one aspect of it. I'm not saying it's the only thing, but when you look at humans, what is it that we're really after? Like, what's the point of this? And to me, this really hits something so important that we all sort of want to be able to connect in a way where someone sees you and appreciates that. But it's so hard to do because, again, we're fragile. We don't want to really show what we're not going to be accepted for. And, most people come out of places where there's a lot of criticism and judgments that their parents got from other people, and they teach you to be more insecure and more fragile instead of, talking openly when you make a mistake, where it's like, that's not how we treat people. Let's not do that. And like really teach in a way where feedback is a everyday part of life. It's not a harsh thing. It's just how people relate.
Right.
So yeah, it's the thing of that there's something more to all of this, and it has to do with loving well and connecting and making contact. And it's not all perfect or anything like that, but it's like there's something beautiful in the process of really trying to fight for more. That I'm really passionate about. And so when people come into therapy, they have no idea what I have planned for them. Now, I'm not going to push something in a way where if they're not willing to do it, but when they start, they're usually like, a lot of people are on the brink of divorce. Some people come in and there's been affairs, and they can get to a place where their marriage is better than it ever was. And that it's all just showing this is where you're having a hard time dealing with yourself. And that if you tighten this up and really start to work on the dilemma you're avoiding, you can start to have something you've never had. And that's the other thing, is that you're having something in life that you've never experienced, you never thought you could experience. And it creates a kinder, gentler world for people, and it gives you something more to look forward to, I think.
I think it's really important that you said that, because I think it's, you're right. It's like, why else? Like, what, what? Yeah. In a way, why even do the work that you do? Right. It's like, for some reason, that's easy to forget. It can just be like, it can almost just feel like, whoa, this isn't functioning the way it's supposed to, so let's go fix it. It can feel very mechanical. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But you forget that it's like, I really, like, I just, like a general I really just want to do this. Yeah. That's really,
that's what the whole thing is about.
Why else would you do any of this?
Yeah, and there's all these problems that get in the way of that, and it's sort of being a therapist in this approach is about trying to understand just, I think, how squirrely we get when we're afraid, and trying to pay attention to how this plays out. And you do, have to pull in some of the neurobiological things people learn in their homes, especially more problematic homes. And you have to sort of work all these things, compress people down to their dilemma, not let them put the pressure on me or their partner or whatever. And the more pressure, the more squirrely people get. And if they settle down and start to deal with themselves more honestly, if they really are willing to take the hit, which is something else that is sort of language within this approach, which is that one of the things that's fundamental if there's no getting around is you have to take hits about who you are. And it's painful to watch. And it's a lot of work also on the therapist where you have to be with people. And this is the therapist intimacy capacity, that you walk somebody into their own pain and you don't look away from it. And you try to be there with them in a moment where you don't let your anxiety take it away, you fix it for them, and you help them be able to do something that, again, nobody ever taught them to do. And from that, they can start to build something. So,
that is a very intimate
yes.
practice.
And you're showing them what it looks like to make contact also.
Right.
Yeah, in that moment, you're trying to make contact with them. And it's a spiritual experience whenever that happens. Especially, for me, it's really remarkable to see people come in really impaired and very miserable. And they start to soften up even the way that they look, like their faces. And
I was going to ask you, what are your clues that you're making contact?
You can watch someone's brain state increase. So the neurobiological, maybe sometime we'll talk about the neurobiological component, because
awesome.
You can actually track brain state. So like one of the ideas within this approach is that your symptoms exist within your brain state. And so when you can push somebody's functioning up in one session where they start to talk differently, look differently. They have a wider range of affect. Like you can track it.
Yeah.
And then it's hard to make it stick in some ways, but that's when they start to have that, they can function better, and it actually starts to generate the differentiation system within the couple better. Wow. Or like if you're not functioning well, you're not even like thinking very well.
It's like an animation thing. It's like, are you animated?
That is one sign someone's brain state has gone up.
Oh,
yes.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. But it's just one. You can also see like people start to look smarter, because one aspect of this is something called like a steady state regression, which means you're functioning below your capacity, but people think it's your personality because you're always like that. And you can think about people you've talked to where it's like, why does this person, like they're not slow, but like something's not clicking.
Yeah, I've had people notice that in me before. Like, what's going on?
That's like an example of probably an acute regression. Steady state regress people are like, they're always sort of like this.
Okay.
And so you can sort of bump them up if you make contact in a way and you help to jog their brain together. Acute regressions are something like, else that
would be more moment to moment.
Yes. Like if you're if you feel depressed, most of the time it's an acute regression, for example. Okay. Like, there's so much, though.
Okay, but that would be, like, in myself, like, a sign of a change of brain state.
That's absolutely right, yes.
Like, I just want something different. Yeah.
Yeah, and one way to work on that, honestly, is just to try to pay attention to what transpired between whenever I seem to be doing okay and now.
Exactly, yeah.
And looking at what typically you've had contact with someone else's brain that induced something that tanked your functioning.
Right.
Yeah. And you can almost trace it back to the very moment.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah. And there's ways to, there's so much you can do that it's amazing once you start to look at the brain and how it works. Yeah. So, yeah, that's something for another time, I think, because you can see, I've been going for hours now, and I could talk for more, and I don't want people to go to sleep.
Oh, you're good. I'd say, within the bounds of another half hour sounds good. Mm-hmm.
But I feel pretty good at where it's at right now. I guess one of the things I would ask you, is there anything in there that sort of doesn't really make sense, or you feel like it would? And I could talk about the points of balance, I guess. At this point, I don't know if anybody would still be watching the video.
Give us a quick summary.
Okay.
Oh, they totally would be. You'd be surprised. There are people that like long-form content, I promise.
Okay, so the points of balance are solid, flexible self is the first one.
Okay.
And that is, I sort of described it earlier, where this is where a person over time decides, what type of person they are and what they believe in, and they are well thought out and sort of what they stand for, and they're not easily changed because they walk into a group and a person says, "Hey, I hate, eggs. That's the only thing I can come up with right now at the end of this talk.
Okay.
It's like, me too, even though like you eat eggs for breakfast, lunch, and dinner.
Okay.
You know, that's the opposite of solid self, right?
Okay.
Which is that you're really malleable to people's pressures. Solid self is that you're going to stand by what you believe, but the flexible part is that you're willing to admit when you're wrong, and that you'll look at, it's really what, you know, again, that reference I was using about people of color and trying to get, you know, white people to actually say, you know what, I was wrong about this, or maybe I do have a lot of implicit biases, and yes, I'm racist, because how could you not be in the way that we have been wired? So the second one is called Quiet Mind, Calm Heart. And this is two parts to it, obviously. So quiet mind is the part of where you really work on not letting your anxieties run you. And the calm heart is where you learn to better tend to your emotional wounds. That you don't overindulge them, but you don't act like they don't exist. You work through them in a way where you don't wear them around and damage other people. So important. Another thing I wanted to mention back on solid flexible self is a lot of solid flexible self is working on developing your own integrity, which is just your internal checks and balances system. It's not related to morality as much as people try to use that sort of like synonymously. Integrity is basically the continuity between who you say you are and who you actually are. And there's most people run a really high discrepancy between who they say they are and who they actually are. And trying to clean that up is within solid flexible self.
Wow. Okay.
So solid flexible self is number one. Quiet mind, calm heart is number two. Number three is called grounded responding. And this you can see is sort of related in some. You can see the other components and how they kind of fit in with this. Grounded responding sort of hits more around collaborative alliances because it means that you don't overreact or underreact to things. So people typically fall in one camp, like, or the other. That something can be going on and they don't deal with it. Like, let's say if you had a kid who had like a learning disability, but you don't really want to come to terms with that because it upsets you, so you don't do anything about it, let it go by for a couple of years, or your partner's cheating on you or something like that. Or to the point where everything's like a disaster and you like can't manage yourself. So this is working on how do you respond to what's happening in a way where you take care of it and do it more collaboratively. So, and then the last one, which is actually my favorite, is called meaningful endurance. And it's a really important part of differentiation because to grow, you have to be willing to go through really difficult times and hold on to what your goals are. So it's the only way you can accomplish anything really meaningful in life is to be able to endure for longer periods of time. That you can't, and so anybody who's great at anything has this ability. And they work on strengthening it, right? You can't give up whenever you start to have a hard time. And so in marriage or in friendship or any type of relationship, you have to be willing to. The pandemic's a really good example of this. You're watching people like lose it at different points, myself included. Okay, I want to be clear. It really helps bring into the forefront like where you have weak points in these. That's one of the points of it. Actually, points of balance are helping you to be able to sort of pinpoint. Okay, I'm having a problem. Where does it fit within this? And you can kind of hone in on one aspect of it and say, okay, it's my quiet mind. My anxiety is running everything. I need to work on calming myself down. But back to meaningful endurance, it's also knowing when to stop something and let go of something if it's holding on is stupidity. Okay, so
that would be more like meaningless endurance.
Good point.
Right?
Yes.
Like I am in this, but I don't really know why.
Yeah, a lot of people, for example, like in staying in a marriage that's terrible, but not really willing to do anything about it, and sort of wearing that again like a badge of honor. Like I'm married. I've been married for 30 years, and it's like you really shouldn't be proud of that. It's terrible.
Right. Okay.
But that's not an example of meaningful endurance. It's like really
that's just endurance.
Sticking. That's right. That's right. It's really sticking to something and dealing with really hard times and holding on throughout that. Yeah. So
I am glad we dove into those. Even it's crazy sometimes even just seeing the structure of a concept. Mm-hmm. And not even having somebody sit with you and coach you all the way through all of them. Just seeing. Mm-hmm. Like under this umbrella has been really nice for him. But just the points of balance.
They really help break down differentiation. Differentiation of self is a term that takes so much time to understand.
Oh, these are the ones that were under differentiation.
Yes, I'm glad that. Okay. Yeah, so that is basically how David Snarsh came up with these in order to sort of say, these, if you work on these, they will help increase your differentiation. These are sort of 4 components of it. And also that point I made earlier about trying to, you know, if you're, sometimes when you run into a problem, it's hard to know, okay, how do I break this down? And it kind of helps with that.
No,
and
awesome.
You're going to find a problem in those things. And the more you strengthen your points of balance, the more resilient you are. The more you can tolerate things, the less likely you are to drop your end of collaboration. And you're just a more stable human. And that is an example of how you love well. You can think about if a person can manage those things better. When crisis hits, you're not going to lose your shit. Not for long anyway.
Or avoid it.
Yeah. Like you'll some, right? One of the aspects of this is that, I can't believe I forgot to say this to you. A collaborative alliance, one of the tenets of that is that you reestablish collaboration to get back on track. Because everybody drops their end of things. And so it's more important that you reestablish it than the fact that you dropped it to begin with. That's so important to it. But when you are in sort of working on your points of balance, you're going to find your limitations. They're going to be right there in front of you. And it's frustrating. But trying to just, relate to it like this is part of being human. Let me just try to get back on track is really a really good way to work on it. Because, it really does help over time that you can tolerate a lot more.
Yeah. To reiterate just for listeners, the 4 points of balance were solid, flexible self, quiet mind, calm heart, grounded response, and meaningful endurance. I think that's just a nice structure. And then zooming up, and correct me if I have any of this wrong, the main points that at least we've covered under Crucible Approach are alliances, differentiation, mind mapping, and grid log. Mm-hmm. Cool.
There's certainly more, but those are ones I work with regularly.
Okay, great. That's awesome. I'm trying to think if I have any last questions on this. I think I like to just say I like to take these theories and just if you could give us a really simple starting point. I mean, obviously, people can research more, for sure, but based on let's just say with just the information that you gave us in the last 2 hours, what is a simple way for somebody to start trying to apply this in their life? Is it just is that maybe establishing a goal of I want to be able to withstand higher pressure? I don't know. Just how would you take just somebody who hasn't heard of this before and say, here's a way you can begin practicing?
Well, one thing I would say is that I think that there are a couple of books that you could read that would help you be able to break it down more specifically in your relationship that Dr. Snarsh wrote. One of them is called Intimacy and Desire. Okay. And then the newest one is called Brain Talk. And maybe for the listeners, his last name is kind of hard to spell, or it's hard to sound out by what I'm saying, but it's Schnarch. So it looks like Snarch, but it's pronounced Snarch, and his first name is David. So that helps, but I would say one of the ways to begin to work on this is to really try to focus on you. And when you're involved in relationship with people, trying to pay attention to getting a more clear picture of yourself, trying to actually be willing to be open and talk to the people in your life and see if they're willing to give you a more accurate picture where you have problems. Or maybe you might know where you have difficulty, right? Let's say that you have a tendency to get really mad, or you cut people off, or a lot of people have ideas about the problems they're having in relationships or commitment issues or things like that. That I think if you take whatever it is and see if you can kind of apply it to one of these points of balance, then you can begin to sort of break down and work on some of that. So, if you have a problem with solid, flexible self, let's say that that you're sort of a pushover, or you don't feel like you can really hold on to your ideas, or you're sort of people come into their chameleon of sorts, that you start to work on maybe you're going to try to spend some more time with yourself and decide what you really think. And just see if you can practice holding on to yourself better with people, that you don't, like you try to catch yourself, or like, let's say you're with somebody and you succumb to the pressure and maybe say, like, let's say you don't want to talk about people. Okay, this is one of the things that I've worked on, right? Where I can be pretty judgmental, or I don't like to get involved in conversations where I'm like, people talking shit on people, right? Mm-hmm. So let's say that somebody sort of induced that and they're wanting to do that with you. And it's hard. That's an example of someone induct you in collusion and you're trying to be collaborative, and you have to now confront them and say, I really don't feel comfortable talking about that. I don't want to get into that. But let's say you succumb to the pressure and you sort of said something, and then like you're paying attention later and like try to correct that. Like go back and say, hey, I just want to be clear. Like I'm not trying to judge you, but I just don't feel comfortable talking about this. And I don't want to relate like that. I'm really trying hard to not do that. And so that's an example of trying to align your integrity, trying to be more solid human. But it could also be that, let's say that you just lose your shit all the time. You get really mad or you're really anxious all the time. I mean, the grounded responding could be the anger part. The quiet mind is the anxiety part. You might start to work on, I'm going to pay attention more to my anxiety and make decisions out of what I think is the right thing, not what I feel like I'm compelled to do because of my anxiety. Mm-hmm. So I guess I'm saying, trying to look at your life problem and try to relate that back to one of these things and think about, okay, what would it look like to try to push that, stretch it out, if you will. Meaningful endurance is a pretty easy one, where if you find you quit things a lot, that's where you're having a problem. Like, see if you can push that, like get yourself to actually decide you're going to do something and make yourself do it.
Mm-hmm. That's great. I mean, I think those are easy enough, like, examples to see. I mean, it could be so many things. But,
yes, yeah.
But I think you're right that we all have actually a pretty good idea of places that we lack.
Yes.
Sometimes we just don't have strategies. But when you're talking about that, even just the example of like going to somebody and saying, hey, just, this is not something that I'm actually comfortable talking about in the future. I don't like this kind of conversation, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
I can just attest to seeing yourself break your pattern even just once. Of like, oh, I've never seen myself stand up to somebody like that, and seeing that it goes fine.
Yes.
Or seeing that they usually will be respectful of that, or for me, sometimes I have anxiety about asking off for work, but just realizing, hey, if you just ask, a lot of times, most of the time, it's actually fine.
Yeah.
But you have to see yourself ask, you have to see the response come back, but once you do, it's easier in the future.
Yes, hopefully. So that's so important in the theory about one of the things, like the idea is that you have to act your way into feeling different, not the other way around. And so making the move is what helps in build anxiety tolerance, because you had to push through the anxiety to get the thing. And that, let's say that it went bad, like you said something to your friend, they took it really personal because now you're reflecting that they're a bad person and they feel like that's what you're saying about them, because now they're starting to deal with their own anxiety and what's going on. That there's also, so it sort of catapults us back on you, where it helps you develop your solid self and your anxiety tolerance if you can sort of sit with that feeling of, okay, now they're mad at me.
But I still did what I had to do.
It usually helps you with your integrity and your solid self if you do the right thing, even when it's hard and people are mad. But most of the time, it will catapult you into this questioning process. And depending on how good the person is at making you feel like you're the problem, it gets worse. But if you deal with that and allow the anxiety to think about this realistically as a human being, if someone's mad at you, like how many people, I guarantee everybody who watches this can relate to a time when they were up worrying and for days about a conflict or something that they did or something somebody like said, and you're like, oh my God, I can't believe that. Or like you're mad at them. But most of the time, I guess in my perspective, I'm like worried about they're mad at me. They hate me. I'm not going to be friends with me anymore because I made a mistake, or they're going to think something about me. And that is good for you to wrestle with and get to the more you develop these, that doesn't happen as much anymore. Like, you get to the point where it's like, I think I did do this. They're justified in being upset about that. But I can't, I can't change that anymore. I'm not going to, fret about the fact that they think I'm this type of person. Maybe they got me wrong. Maybe the reality is Mostly I do feel like I'm this, but that's my validating yourself more than that. The other people have to think that about you. Because the more integrity you have, the more consistency you're going to have, and people are going to be able to track that in too.
Yeah.
So, you have to be able to tolerate, maybe people hate your guts. Okay.
Yeah.
Like they really might think you suck, or you have done some things that you really regret, and you know that they have reason to think you suck. And,
right. That's probably, I would guess one of the most universally difficult things is just sitting with the idea that not everybody thinks you're all that jazz.
That's right.
And,
there are people that hate me, which is so interesting because, like, if you think about it, there are people you do not like, but most people really want to be liked universally, and also be able to, like, not everybody's their taste. It's
right.
like, what kind of ideas do we have about, like, the level of needs of, like, being loved and desired by people, and that becomes less and less, and you're less like set off when people sort of show you something that, like, oh, they don't like me.
Right.
But all of these things, the more you push it, like, induce sort of like different parts of the points of balance, and you just sort of try to work with it.
Help each other, right?
Yes, they all are interwoven. Those are just some examples. There are more specifics I work with people on. Like, sometimes a client will come in, they really have a hard time with, like, say, one of them, and I'll give them more specific strategies on that.
Sure.
But most of the time, people can figure them out too if they just are willing to actually get into it and, like, pay attention to themselves and what comes up and see if they can sustain something longer. Like, that'll give you more information.
Cool. That's awesome. Yeah, I would love to talk about this even longer. But this does seem like a good kind of point to wrap up with. So, thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Like, so much. This is such valuable information, and I hope that it does pique people's interests. I hope that they learn more. I hope that people maybe see that there's other approaches to their relational puzzles that they might have never thought of before, that there's hope for change, that if they're in gridlock, that's actually a good sign.
Yes.
That doesn't mean that they're failing, etc. I think there's a lot in here to benefit people. So I just, your time is very valuable, so thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for doing this. I'm really happy to be able to have an opportunity to talk about what I love.
Yeah, let's do it again.
Definitely.
Cool. Thank you.